Chapter 5. The following day, the entire household seemed to have forgotten that Rue existed. That suited her perfectly. The first thing she did was to hurry down the hall in bare feet, still dressed in her pajamas, to listen for the humming. She waited for a while, sitting on the cold hallway floor, her arms wrapped around her legs to keep the chill off them. The only sound was the hiss of the waves outside. The silence in the house had an unnatural quality, as though everything were holding its breath, waiting. It reminded Rue of the silence right before the gunshots cracked above her head at their trailer. She fought an urge to flee and kept herself rooted, just as she had underneath the trailer, waiting, listening, but the house remained silent and still. Back in her room, she opened the wardrobe and fingered the clothes they had bought for her. The material was softer and thicker than she was used to, but Miss Valentine was right. They were too big for her. She put on her old corduroys and a t-shirt from her hefty bag and pulled her hooded sweatshirt over that and went downstairs. The first floor was as silent as the second, though the large windows in some of the rooms flooded the hallway with light and made the place seem less gloomy. Idly, Rue walked across the tiled floor, letting her fingers trail across the wall. Now she could see why the wall had seemed so lumpy the day before. Carved into the mahogany wainscoting were blooms of flowers. They trellised across the wall, huge and tropical looking. Hidden within the petals and crawling along the stem were tiny insects with their wings as thin as paper. Rue touched these very lightly, marveling at their hair-thin veins and the furrowed edges of wings. Farther up the hallway, she discovered the face of a carved monkey peering out from between a snarl of large leaves. Its wide eyes stared back at her. She let her finger slip into its slightly open mouth, and she felt the pin-prick of tiny sharp teeth against her finger, poised to bite. She laughed at it, then stopped quickly when she heard a man's voice from farther up the hall. "Dr. Orlett?" "That's my uncle," Rue thought. She felt a jumble of curiosity and nervousness, though she could not understand why she should be afraid. She waited another minute, then stealthily crept along the hallway toward the room that Miss Valentine had knocked on the day before. The door was open now. Rue peered around the door frame. It was a huge room, paneled with dark wood, its high ceiling braced with thick timber beams. Opposite the door was a window trimmed with stained glass, giving a fine view of the stormy, gray seaway. In the center of the room was a large pool table. The green vase top was almost completely covered with maps. The maps looked as if they were photos of treetops, taken from a plane, and it was here Rue's Uncle Emmett stood, with his back to Rue, studying the maps. He was tall and slim, dressed in loose tan trousers and a silky cream-colored shirt. He should have appeared elegant, but instead he looked frail. The wrists that poked out of his sleeves were too narrow and bony for a grown man. As he stared down at the map, the fingers of his right hand rested lightly on the edge of the pool table, while the other hand was in his pocket. Rue watched him for several minutes. He did not move the entire time, not the slightest bit. He knows how to be still, like me. His head swiveled to the door quickly, as though he had just then felt her presence. When she saw him, her eyes went wide. In front of her stood her own father, miraculously alive again. Had his murder been a lie? Or was this a ghost? No, that was impossible. She wanted to run to him, to fling her arms around him and press her face into his chest. But then she noticed his eyes, flat and hard-looking. They were nothing like her father's eyes. He gazed down at her, frowning absently, as though she were disturbing the thought that had suddenly popped into his head. "I'm Rue," she said. "Who else could you possibly be?" he replied coldly. Now that she looked at him more carefully, she could see the differences. The thin nose was not as short as her father's, the lips more precise. He looked displeased as he took in her old sweatshirt and the frayed corduroys. "Didn't Miss Valentine buy you new clothes?" he asked. "I like my own," Rue replied, her voice matching his in coldness. He looked at her sharply, as though she had just suddenly come into focus for him. Your father was stubborn too. Much good it did him. He paused, staring at her circumspectly, and then said, Do you miss him? He asked this in a peculiarly unemotional way, like a doctor might poke at a wound and say, Does this hurt? It made Rue angry, and she answered defiantly, No. But her voice sounded odd. Her throat had tightened, and she realized with horror that she was a hair's breadth away from tears. Her uncle noticed. He sighed. His face softened, and suddenly Rue saw her father again, the likeness shocking, mesmerizing. I hope you'll be happy here, Rue, he said. If there's anything you need, you can ask Miss Valentine. Then he abruptly turned back to his maps. Rue stayed where she was and staring at him. She didn't think she liked him, and he didn't seem to like her very much either. Yet she wanted him to turn around again, to relive that sensation of her father being in front of her, still alive. Turn around, she willed him in her thoughts. But no, he was lost in the map's green wilderness once again. He was done with her. She retreated down the hallway until she found herself in the entrance lobby. Pushing open the massive front door, she stepped outside onto the cobblestone promenade. A light rain was falling, nudged this way and that by a fitful wind. Rue made her way down the granite steps towards a stretch of lawn mottled with thin patches of snow. She cut across it, past a semicircular patio, and headed toward the tiny lagoon where the moored Boston whaler was now bobbing lightly. The wind blew more gently here, bringing with it a tangy odor of fish and cold fog. Following the path around the lagoon, she walked over the small footbridge that led to the stone archway. Here she climbed out onto the great rocks that hemmed the edges of the island. The stones were splattered with gold droppings, but she found a clean spot and sat down. The movement of the river was dizzying at first. The slate gray water rushed past, twisting and hissing like a tangle of frantic snakes. If you watched one spot, you thought the water was rushing north, but if you shifted your glance, it seemed as if it were heading east. After a few minutes, Rue felt as though she were the one who was moving, and she had to take her eyes off the current to keep from feeling wobbly. From this perch, she could see several of the other islands rising out of the restless St. Lawrence. Some had simple cottages on them, but many had majestic houses with landscaped lawns, still winter dull and speckled with snow, sloping down toward the water. Rue had never seen anything like it. In Limpet, the fanciest building was the library, but its bricks were grimy and the front columns were peeling and listing to the right. These homes were by far the grandest she had ever seen, yet they all seemed deserted. No people, no boats. The only movement came from the tops of the pines as they shuddered in the wind. The burr of a motor sliced through the river's hiss. A small boat with a bright green hull and a white canopy curled around the island and was now heading straight for the stone arch entry. Rue stiffened and hurried to her feet, intent on hiding, but it was too late. The men in the boat had spotted her. There were two of them. The older man with gray hair and glasses was at the wheel. He raised his hand to her in greeting. Sitting in the passenger seat was a peculiar-looking younger man dressed in a black suit jacket. He had blonde hair, as thick as a lion's mane, and he stared at Rue steadily as the boat pulled through the arch and into the lagoon. "Can it be? Is it? The famous Rue Fanshawe!" the older man called heartily to Rue as he climbed out of the boat, carrying a stack of envelopes. This took Rue aback. How did he know who she was? She stared suspiciously at the man without saying a word. He approached her, holding out his hand, but when she didn't step forward to take it, he withdrew it and smiled quizzically. "A shy one. Well, that's all right. Violet's mouthy enough for 20 Rue Fanshaws. I'm Simon Lachambe, the island mail carrier. Won't you run this in for your uncle?" He handed Rue the stack of envelopes bound by a rubber band, and a small padded envelope marked "Fragile." The man with blonde hair was standing behind the mailman, listening and watching Rue intently. Now he stepped forward rigidly. The movement made the mailman's mouth flicker briefly with displeasure. "And who is this young lady?" The blonde man asked, his eyes never leaving Rue's face. He was a short, square-shaped man, with skin too olive-colored for his blonde hair. His cheeks were thick and oily. "Better shake a leg, Doc." The mail carrier's voice suddenly turned curt. The weather's only going to get nastier as the day goes on." "Weather doesn't bother me," the blond man said evenly. It certainly didn't seem to. The mail carrier was wearing a nylon winter jacket. The blond man's jacket was thin, and beneath it he wore a white button-down shirt with the top buttons undone. "Maybe not, but it's Valentine who will be shuttling me back to Clayton, and I'm sure she doesn't want to get caught in a storm," Simon replied gruffly. The blond man said nothing. He stared back at the mail carrier with a half-smile on his lips, waiting until the mailman's shoulders shifted uneasily before saying very pompously, "Thank you for the ride, kind sir." He bowed with a flourish, then started up the path toward the house. Simon Lachaume clearly found the man offensive, but he also seemed baffled by him. He watched the man's retreating back for a few moments, then shook his head once, to himself. "Who is that?" Rue asked. "What? That guy? Ouellette. He's your uncle's doctor." "Is my uncle sick?" Rue asked. Simon's eyes flickered to the house, then back at Rue. He shrugged. "Couldn't say." "You won't say," Rue thought, and watched the man's face carefully. "So what do you think of island life so far?" Simon asked her, his voice more cheerful now. "I don't like it," Rue said. "No?" He looked surprised. But then he added, "Well, I guess it is lonely here this time of year. There's some of us year-rounders on Donkey Island, but you can't see Donkey Island from Cough Rock, and all the houses around here are shut up until the summer. It feels like you're the only person on the planet, doesn't it? Well, when the weather turns, Violet can take you over to Donkey and find you a mess of summer kids to play with." "I don't care about being alone," Rue said. Simon looked pleased at this. "Well, seems like you're already a river rat." "What's that?" "It's the sort of person who doesn't like a lot of jibber-jabber. The river's company enough." "But I don't like the river," Rue said, looking out at the agitated waves. "You don't trust the river," Simon said. "And you shouldn't. You don't know her yet, and she doesn't know you. But you got river rat in your DNA. Your grandfather was one. He knew every musky hole for miles around. Your father was a river rat too. He was always out on the river, traveling between the islands. That kid knew how to handle a skiff before he could ride a bike." This interested Rue. She had only ever seen her father in a boat once, when he took her fishing on a large pond hidden up in the hills. They had stayed for hours, but what she remembered best about the trip was that it was the first time he told her the story about Pendragon, the flying boat. It was a red and yellow boat, captained by a boy named Vincent, who piloted it above the treetops and through the sky. Every so often, Vincent would anchor his skyboat on a rain cloud. Then he would parachute down to earth, always landing in the middle of an impossibly dangerous situation. Rue had loved the story about Pendragon, and whenever she had trouble sleeping, she would beg her father for a new installment about the flying boat. "Now, your uncle in there." Simon nodded toward the house. "He never took to the water. Afraid of it, he says so himself. He doesn't even own a boat. He has Miss Valentine shuttle him around in hers." There was a hint of disapproval in his voice. "Then why does he stay here?" Rue asked. Simon hesitated, his expression suddenly turning cautious. I guess he has his reasons," he replied. "Remember to give Valentine the mail. She won't be expecting it. I generally bring the mail to the post office on Chokecherry Island, and Valentine fetches it. But when the weather's nasty, sometimes I pop by. Saves her a trip." He held out his hand again. "So long, Rue Fanshawe." This time she gave it a quick, reserved shake. The sky was already darkening as Simon's boat pulled out of the lagoon, spun to the right, and tore off. Its wake rolled back toward the island and thrashed against the rocks for a moment or two before quieting. The water was changing color too. It was now a slick gray-black, the color of wet stone. Here and there an ice floe drifted past slowly. The river had suddenly calmed, yet Rue could feel it gathering itself together, forming something new and spiteful. It reminded her of how the girls at the Burroughs' house conferred while standing a few yards away, quietly plotting some fresh torment for Rue. From the west, a large bird appeared in the sky, its neck bent, its long body rising and dipping. A heron. Beneath the heron, drifting on the river, was a large ice floe with a curious dark shape on top of it. Rue fixed her eyes on the shadowy hump, perplexed. The floe skimmed the edge of the island closest to Cough Rock, an oval island with a neat terraced lawn that led up to a magnificent olive green house. When the ice floe came close to the island, a black figure leapt off the ice and onto the island. Even from a distance, Rue could see the figure was a boy. He stood on the bank for a moment, looking around. Then he grew perfectly still. It seemed to Rue that he was staring right at her, though at this distance she couldn't be certain. The boy turned abruptly and bounded up the terraced lawn, climbing the ledges rather than the stairs, and disappeared around the back side of the house. Rue hurried back over the footbridge, skirting the lagoon, and ran around the edge of the island, trying to catch another glimpse of the boy. At first she saw nothing, but after a few seconds she spotted him again. Astonishingly, he was now standing on one of the lower roofs of the house. Suddenly he raised one arm. Was he waving to her? The very next minute the water darkened and became opaque. The sky seemed to drop closer to the earth, as though the river had yanked it down. A torrent of fine, icy rain began to lash at the ground and peck at Rue's face. She shoved the mail beneath her shirt and pulled up her sweatshirt's hood, but the thin cotton was already soaked through. Squinting through the curtain of rain, she watched the shadowy form on the roof. Suddenly, the wind changed directions, as though someone had summoned it. It drove into her face so violently that it felt like an assault, forcing her to run. Rue refused. She turned her back to the wind, twisting her head to keep her eyes on the boy. The river grew frantic, crashing against the island's banks. Then the wind whipped around yet again, even more fiercely now, and this time Rue surrendered, running back to the house while the river thrashed and hissed triumphantly back at her.